Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofrumento, and today we have got a sprinkling of not just an incredible guest that I'm excited to introduce you to, but also improv comedy, because it is at the root of what Kristen's work is that I'm so excited to talk about here today. So I'm actually going to introduce you straight away to today's guest. Her name is Kristen Brun. She's an executive and leadership coach and corporate facilitator who previously spent 15 years leading teams in advertising tech and marketing at companies ranging from early stage startups to Fortune 100 companies. Today, she helps executive leaders advance their careers, make better decisions, execute change effectively, develop innovative solutions, and successfully engage their teams. Like I said, all with a little sprinkling of some improv comedy. She's an ICF credentialed coach, which is considered the gold standard in the world of coaching. She has a master's degree in management, strategy, and leadership from Michigan State University. Her unique approach combines evidence-based business and leadership frameworks with principles and skills from improv theater in order to help her clients accelerate their impact. There's so much goodness that I don't even know. Speaking of improv, we don't even know where this conversation's going to go today, but I know it's going to be deeply impactful on all of our businesses in the way that we view teams, our own growth, our personal trajectories. So I'm excited about this one. Let's dive into my interview today with Kristen Brun. All right, Kristen, I am so excited that you're here with us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Heck yes. Obviously, I told listeners just a little bit about you. I'm clearly excited about so many aspects of your brilliance, but fill in those gaps. Take us beyond the bio. Who is Kristen? How did you get here?
Yeah, so I live in San Francisco with my fiance and our two cats who might make an appearance. And I love to travel and also just making things that are tangible in addition to the very intangible aspect of my work. So right now that's a lot of wedding DIY projects, but usually crochet. And I've always been really into personal leadership development. So that's one of my favorite parts of my work today is I get to read books and then bring the most valuable insights back to my clients. And then finally, I think as you teased with the intro, I am also an avid improviser. So I'm in one primary group right now called Required Taste, and we perform regularly in San Francisco. We also do festivals around the country, and I just absolutely love improv. It's both incredibly fun, and it also has a lot of really, really amazing benefits to it. So, and I really love bringing in aspects of it into the coaching, training, and facilitation that I do for work.
Yeah, that is so cool. Honestly, I think that the work that you get to do is awesome in so many different ways. And I love the fact, Kristen, I'm going to give you a shout out because I love the fact that you brought in some of your hobbies into your bio. It's something that I so relate with. I feel like all of us entrepreneurs, we are passionate people, and that tends to exhibit itself in our hobbies. And I love the fact that you are crocheting one of those. Like that's something that takes you deep into it. And I'm sure you're like me where you see the parallels into broader life, because clearly you see those parallels and you're going to spell out a lot of them for us when it comes to improv in business. But I think at the root of so much of what you do is that leadership in that team aspect. And I'm super excited to start diving into that stuff today. When you talk about leadership within the scope of business, there's so many different facets of it. We, as a lot of solo entrepreneurs, we are our own leaders. We are the business leaders. We are leaders when it comes to leading our client engagements. What are all the different ways that you view leadership in business?
Yeah, no, as you said, there are so many different ways. And I think it's one thing people tend to associate it with people who are managers with direct reports, but leadership is so much more than management alone. So yeah, I think you named a lot of them as far as entrepreneurs go. I think anybody who works with a team, leadership is really critical. And that means both setting a vision and being able to inspire and motivate people and to really engage your team so that you can execute effectively against that vision.
Yeah, and I'm going to be honest. Obviously, I respect you so much because of the work that you do, but also because of the passion that you bring into it. And part of that respect is that, Kristen, I know how much of your work is intentional. I know that you choose your words wisely. I know that you're very intentional about the message that you put out there. And that's why one thing that really catches my eye about your business, which your business is Emboldify. We'll talk about it, give links at the end of this session. But the headline on your website is empowering leaders with the power of improv. Empowering. To me, that's the word that stands out there because it is about improv, not just being something we use, but having it be something that empowers us. Talk to us about your beliefs behind that and what really stokes that fire for us.
Yeah. When I was originally thinking about words that were most associated with what I do, I just kept coming back to the word empower because that's just at the root of what I think a coach and facilitator should do. And part of my mission really is to take the kind of leaders that our world needs more of and to help them increase their impact. And empowering starts with so many things, but I think the parts from improv, especially that I focus on, are authenticity and being able to trust your own instincts. Because that point where you know that something's going to be thrown at you and you have no idea what's coming, but you just have faith in yourself that you're going to figure it out, whatever happens. Like that kind of confidence is a superpower. So that's a lot of what I focus on with empowerment, but a lot of it is also around mindfulness and being present in the moment and being able to listen to people and being able to take risks and create environments that are safe places to take risks that you can fail in. And then finally, just doing things to create safe spaces for creativity. And failure also goes into that a lot because you can't have creativity without failure.
Yeah, for sure. So much that we're going to dive into just from that one answer. But the place where I really want to start is I'm going to say it out loud because listeners know this about the show. It's one of the things that makes our show so beloved by listeners all over the world is that we have no pre-planned questions. You can listen to any 2 episodes and they have entirely different conversations and questions. And Kristen, I think part of that speaks to what you said is that it's cool bringing on entrepreneurs that have that confidence, that ability to say, whatever it is that we're going to talk about, wherever the conversation goes, I'm going to show up as me. And you already mentioned the A word, authenticity. I think that's what makes these conversations fun is, Kristen, there's nothing I can say that will throw you off today because you can only ever answer these questions as you. Where does that come from? For me, I always attribute it to reps. I've done this 600 plus times. It's easy to be there. But what's your take on it?
I think, well, reps definitely have an impact, but I think a lot of it comes back to the trusting your instincts, which is really difficult because we all have our inner judge inside of us, and how you think of it might be different from person to person, but we all have that part of our brain who's questioning things, and it really tends to get in the way because you might have that initial instinct to do something or to say something, and then the inner judge kicks in and it's like, wait, no, is that answer good enough? Is this actually something smart and intelligent for me to say? Maybe I should just be quiet. So a lot of it really comes down to learning to actually listen to what your instinct is and trust it and not let it just get overpowered by your inner judge, which is really just trying to protect you.
Yeah, I'm going to call this out for listeners because this is something I've long known from my end. And Kristen, I feel like you're publicizing it right now, which is listeners always think when I come on air that, I have the right questions, I have the right points or quotes that I want to make throughout the episode, but it is pretty much 95% of the time when I'm showering the next day, I'll be like, I should have made that point or I should have used that example. And it's something that we talk about it mostly within the context of humor is, we've all seen Seinfeld where George Costanza is like, I should have had this comeback to what that person said in the boardroom the other day. I'm sure as a comedian, you experience that all the time from improv comedy where you say, I told a decent joke, but this joke would have been so much better. So it's something that's inevitable in all of us, but how do you roll with it in the moment? Because you talk about instinct and trusting it. How do we start even tapping into that?
Yeah, every time, every show I do, I always think of something the next day where I'm like, that would have been the perfect one-liner to close that on. But that's just the reality of it. All you can do is what you have and the thoughts that you have at the moment. But there's usually a lot better ones in there than you're trusting because they just get shut down so quickly. And it's one of my favorite things about improv is you're in the moment and you have your inner judge there because it never quite goes away. But if you listen to it, you cannot be a successful improviser because so much of it is about listening and knowing what's happening in a scene. And there's going to be things that are dropped, like names and things like where your setting is or where your scene is taking place. And if you miss those, it's a lot harder to create a coherent scene. And then it's just, it can be a little awkward for the audience. So a lot of it is really just dialing into that listening. Like I call it like whole body or immersive listening, where you're just so in the moment that you're not even planning what your next thing you're going to say is going to be. You're just listening and then responding authentically.
Yeah, Kristen, it almost seems scary. As someone who does extemporaneous speech for a living like I do, getting on an improv stage does seem a heck of a lot scarier, especially the way that you just phrased it, which is you are purely listening without planning out what's going to come out of your mouth in literally just a few seconds in so many ways. And you raised a really fascinating point, which is even when you're on stage, I think as an audience member who I love going to comedy shows, I try to go as much as possible. I guess even though I'm a human, I dismiss the fact that you are up on stage still with the inner critic. I don't know why I thought that it would go away. What are some of your techniques to silencing that inner critic in those moments?
A lot of it comes down to practicing mindfulness. And there's a lot of ways to practice mindfulness. I love meditation, but it doesn't just have to be meditation. There's just different ways to ground yourself in the moment. And that really does come back to reps. Like what you said earlier, like the more you practice with listening to it and then going, okay, well, that thought isn't relevant to me right now, because the thoughts will never go away. Like we're always going to have our brains running constantly with thoughts. It's just about how much focus you give it and how quickly you're able to move on from it versus getting consumed by it. And yeah, mindfulness is a key, but also just doing improv exercises. A lot of what happens in early level classes for improv is basically breaking all of your training of not trusting the first thing you think of and getting you to just say it without pre-planning over and over and over again.
That's fascinating. I love those insights right there, because having never taken an improv class, the only kind of rule of improv that I think we all know, it's such a cliche now, is that response of yes and on that surface, even only knowing that principle of improv, I've always felt that benefits us so much as entrepreneurs. Is that if someone says, for example, something that's very uncomfortable for us as entrepreneurs is when we're having a conversation about pricing or money, these very scary topics, is in my 20s, for example, I had the tendency to say, yeah, no, I hear you, but like we can work it out this way, as opposed to now confidently in my 30s as an entrepreneur with a lot of reps under my belt, I can say yes, and it is that price because XYZ. So you just introduced us to another one, which is trusting that first instinct. What other types of principles from improv are directly applicable to leaders, businesses, entrepreneurs?
So I think a big thing that comes up is creativity, which is how do you drive innovation in your team and company? And a lot of what happens, I think, especially in corporations, is exactly what does not drive that. And one of those big pieces of it is failure, because there are so many cultures where there's terror in making a mistake. And if people are afraid to make mistakes, period, like they cannot be creative. They cannot come up with those ideas. So a lot of it is doing a proper brainstorming session and actually like setting the boundaries of it and enforcing them. Because I think we've all been in brainstorming sessions where somebody says like, okay, there's no bad ideas here, but then you get off track really easily as soon as you start bringing them up. So if you actually really truly enforce it and you separate the divergent thinking from the convergent thinking, with the divergent thinking being like we're actually coming up with like new ideas, like really creative, innovative solutions. And the convergent thinking is the much more like structured problem solving thinking that we also need. But if you try to do them both at the same time, you just lose the creative part.
Yeah, I love that you bring in the visual of group brainstorming sessions, for example. And yeah, you called it out. We've all been in those rooms where someone says there's no bad ideas, throw them all out there. And it's fun for me because so far in this conversation, I feel like we've been looking inward, is talking about, well, let me trust my instinct. Let me trust my ability to say things on the fly. But now you're introducing other people into the equation. And I know that your work, you don't just focus on building better leaders, you focus on building better teams. When we talk about teams, it's fascinating to me to have that culture of, let's just use improv as the example there, because to me, improv brings playfulness, it brings humor, it brings lightheartedness, it brings teamwork into it. When you're on stage with your fellow improv comics, you are all building on each other's jokes and scenes. Talk to us about how we can bring that into our own business environments with our teams, whether it's freelancers that we hire all over the world and our daily engagement is just on Slack channels, or a coworker or a business partner that we're always working with. Talk to us about how these principles apply to that team setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is really one of the core principles of improv, where if you've heard anything about improv, you've probably heard of the concept of yes and. But there's two pieces of that. There's accepting the offers that other people put forth, and then there's adding your own contribution to it. And that really goes both ways. So as a leader, you need to make sure that everybody in your team is contributing, and have that be part of the expectation, is that you need to actually like get contributions from everybody, and everybody needs to be able to weigh into something. So like that's a really big piece of it. But I think I also just really like one of my favorite sayings in improv is make your teammate or your scene partner look good. And that if you really like take that focus of like doing things that are going to make the other person look good, you end up with fantastic improv for one thing. But you also, in a team setting, if you really go into it with having a good intention with working with people and trying to get and elevate their contributions, and really just trying to support them and make them look good, that's when you can really have a group create some beautiful products.
Yeah, that is such an important concept that you raise, Kristen, and making other people look and sound good and be at their best also makes them feel better, makes them do better work. There's so many positive aspects to it. I always think, as someone who interviews someone, I always study like what makes a great interviewer. And people always talk about Johnny Carson, where as a late night comedy host, he viewed his role of, let me set my guest up for the perfect joke. And if he could do that, then he also came across as brilliant because he always had great conversations. So I know that manifests itself inside a lot of different ways in our businesses. You know, one of the ways that I can think, the most simplistic way to make other people look and feel good on your team is within Slack. We have a daily stand-up channel where basically every morning everyone gets DM'd a meeting where it says, you know, what are your priorities for the day, all of this. And then one of those questions that we always include in all of my teams is, what's something that you want to give praise for someone else on the team? And it's those types of daily reminders of, hey, this person's doing amazing work. That's just one example. But Kristen, how does this manifest itself inside of businesses to share that praise, to build others up, to make them look and feel good?
Yeah, so recognition is definitely a big piece of it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that depending on the size and culture of the business or team. But also not just recognizing, but also showing up for people within meetings. Because a lot of it comes to how you act as a leader, like how you show up. And when other people are talking, are you just trying to jump in and get your own point in there, or are you actually truly listening to them and hearing what they're saying and, you know, paraphrasing it back to them, because that's a good active listening technique, and actually like taking it into consideration, like making people feel like they're heard is so important. And as a leader, that will get you the kind of loyalty that nothing else does.
Yeah, Kristen, I feel like we have to talk about that a little bit deeper because I feel like it's easy on the surface level to look at an improv comic on stage and judge them by the things or praise them by the things that they're saying, the funny points that they're making. But so many of your answers keep coming back to, well, first you have to listen to what the other person's saying so that you can build upon that, accept that idea, and then also add your own. Give us some listening tips. I almost feel like that's even more valuable than the funny things that you say because that's what sets you up.
Yeah, and it's so funny on the idea of what comedy is. I call it improv theater instead of improv comedy because I think improv is so much more than just the comic side of it. And there is a lot of actually dramatic improv that doesn't even have to be funny to still be enjoyable to watch as an audience member. But the thing is, if you get down to like authentic improv where people are listening to each other and they're taking each other's their contributions into account and they're adding things and they're like really in sync, funny things will happen. Like that's when the funniest things are said, is when you're just really in the moment. Like that is when the brilliant lines come to you. So it actually creates a funny improv, but it comes from a place of listening and authenticity. And as a leader or like a business owner, there are several things you can do for listening. I think the biggest thing is understanding that there's different levels of listening, and that kind of surface level listening is listening to respond. And this is what most of us do. And for the majority of the day, I would say, is we're listening to what the other person is saying, but we're also already thinking about what our responses is going to be in our head while they're talking, instead of actually just listening to them and waiting for them to finish. So that's really the first thing, is to take it from that kind of surface level listening to respond to actually like immersive listening. There's a level of listening where you're just listening with your entire body. And this is what I do a lot as a coach, because that's a critical aspect of coaching clients. But I'm just so in the moment and watching for not just the words that are coming out of their mouth, but what's happening with their body language, what's happening with their tone of voice, and all of those different signals that come into play. And if I get an inclination about like that they're feeling a certain way, I ask them about it. And that's something that improv also trains us on a lot, is calling out if your scene partner is looking angry, saying like, "You look angry." But it's something that we can integrate more into listening as well, is really clarifying the things that we see from somebody, whether they're saying it verbally or non-verbally.
Yeah, Kristen, so many aspects of that I want to dive into, because you introduced some really subtle but important points for us as entrepreneurs, because I know that you're working with leaders and teams, but I mean, genuinely, this stuff touches every aspect of business. I'm thinking right now, as we're having this conversation, how much it affects sales, for example. People, if they started implementing these things in their sales conversations, becoming a better listener, understanding, accept all of the input that the person is telling you, because that's the valuable stuff to them. Forget your own mind and how concerned you are about your own product or service. They are telling you their pain points, their desires. That is the most valuable stuff. I want to ask you this, because as you know, me thinking about the listeners right now, and whether they're driving, whether they're in the gym listening to us, they're probably thinking, well, Kristen, if I just sat there and listened with my whole being to, let's say, the other side of a sales conversation, when it comes to me, I'm not even going to know what I want to talk about because I'm so busy listening. Talk to us about how you're gauging that.
So that's kind of the magic in it. Is then this is something they also tell you in coaching, if you do like a coach certification, is that pre-planning questions is not the way to go. Like your next question will come up if you listen hard enough to what the person is saying. And it takes so much faith to do that. But it's true. If you're listening hard enough and you're also like trusting your instinct, like and seeing what comes up, you'll know what to say next, and you'll know which of your products or services might be the best fit, and how to bring it up with somebody. You just have to have that faith that you will figure it out and that the answer will be there. And it's terrifying, but it also helps to do reps. Like once you do this more and more, it becomes easier to trust yourself.
Yeah, you beat me to it. That's the thing that I want to echo it for listeners, is that it is terrifying. I'll tell you, as someone on this side of the microphone 5 days a week, the thing that really hits me, Kristen, is that there are times where, because I love listening to guests like you, you are incredible at all the things that you do. And for me, who gets to have these conversations for a living, in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, there are times where, the camera's coming back on me, or my microphone is turning back on after being muted. And I'm just like, shoot, what's my next question? And quite frankly, one thing that quote unquote bails me out from time to time is just that genuine curiosity where I just get to be inquisitive and say, Kristen, that's fascinating. Let's go a little bit deeper there. And so it is that faith that is the scariest, but it's also that faith that brings the good stuff out. So I love that you took it there. I have to ask you this, Kristen, because I think it's fascinating. You've worked inside of tech companies, big companies, small companies. For example, you've worked inside of Yahoo, inside of Verizon, so many different types of companies. And the line of work today is very different. A lot of remote teams today. Tech companies are still growing super fast. Smaller companies with, freelancers on their team. There's all these different compositions, and I'm sure you've worked inside so many different types of businesses. How does it change depending on the types of businesses? Or are you of the belief, which I'm guessing you are, that you can really implement this stuff regardless of team structure? Give us some of those strategies, whether they're remote, in person. Lay it on us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, you guessed my point of view on it, is that this can be applied to any team size, whether it's a team of one or a team of 500. And I actually do have, I can provide the link to you to just share in the show notes, but I actually have a list of free exercises that are improv based exercises that you can just do on your own. Because it comes down to, like, even if you're a team of one, you can still put a lot of this stuff into place. And then if you have a much larger team, it all still applies as well. Like the core skills of listening, of creating like a culture that accepts failure and recognizes that failure is essential for true innovation, and having that supportiveness among managers, like all of that comes to play. It's just kind of whether are you just doing this individually, or are you actually just putting this into place in the culture of a company as well.
Yeah, Kristen, I love that you just teased that document, because for sure we're going to talk about it at the end of today's session. Actually, at this point, I kind of want to invite you, if you want to share with us one of those exercises, let listeners know about those types of things, because a lot of them are probably listening saying, I don't even know where to start. This is a whole new world for me. I'd love to hear one of those exercises.
Yeah. So one thing I really like for drawing out creativity and getting you to trust that initial instinct with yourself is I call it what's under your chair. It goes by many names, but basically you take a few moments, you center yourself, and you tell yourself that somebody left something for you under your chair. And then you're going to pick it up and you're going to say, oh, great, they gave me a blank. It could be a iPhone, it could be a red apple. But the idea is whatever comes to your mind, you take the first thing that comes to your mind. You don't sit there and let yourself second guess it. You're like, okay, this is the first thing that came to my mind. And you really try to see that object. And then you also ask yourself other characteristics about it. Like what color is it? What is it used for? What does it feel like when you're holding it in your hands? Does it have any smell? Does it make a sound? And the idea of this is that you're trying not to pre-plan the object. You're literally just trying to be like, okay, I'm pulling it out from under the chair. And then when I look at it in front of me, this imaginary object, when I see it in my mind's eye is when I say what it is. And doing that often enough will help you get into the habit of not necessarily needing to pre-plan everything, and also just opens up your creativity as well.
Yeah, I love that that's the example that you rolled with, because I can picture myself doing that. And I would imagine the first one or two or three times you sit there and you're like, should I do a camera? Should I do an iPhone? Should I do a soccer ball? All these different things. And I would imagine that by the 20th time of doing it, you sit down and you are so good at it and you're like, today it's a pencil. And you just step right into it. So I love that, Kristen. I have to ask you this. Time is flying by here today, but I feel like we're only scratching the tip of the iceberg about all these things that you're amazing at. And one thing that really permeates through all of your answers, Kristen, is failure. And it would be easy for me to make the surface level observation of, it sounds like you really embrace failure. But I'm going to go way beyond that. It actually sounds like you view failure as part of the creativity process. Why do you link those two together so much? What is it about failure that unlocks creativity, or maybe it frees up creativity? I want to hear your deeper thoughts on that.
Yeah. And it's funny because when you say the words embracing failure, I hate failure as much as the next person. Like, I am a recovering perfectionist, and that I've gotten a lot better with it over the years. But my nature is very averse to failure. And it's something that is a part of growing, and especially a part of being an entrepreneur. But you're absolutely right. It's that failure is a part of that creative process. And the reason for that is for creativity to really happen, you need to be able to quiet that inner judge. Because if you're judging your ideas as soon as you have them, you're going to shut down the creative process. It's like the same thing with a lot of writers say they have rules for pages where they have to just write out everything without editing it, and then they can go back later and edit it because the idea is just getting it on the page first. It's the same idea. Like, you need to give yourself a separate space to have the ideas. And then separately, you can go through the judging part where you're actually figuring out, like, okay, is that actually a viable idea, and so forth. So where failure comes in for that is that if you don't allow yourself to fail often and try to avoid it as much as possible, it seems much scarier and uglier than it actually is. And it becomes this thing that you try everything to avoid, which means you're not going to take risks. And if you don't take risks, you're not going to be able to come up with those truly creative ideas. So a lot of what I talk about is creating a safe space for failure to happen. So that can be everything from like a brainstorming session, or a lot of people actually work it into their company culture. So they might have like a failure board where somebody makes a mistake that's kind of funny, especially, it goes on the board. And this only works if the leader is doing it as well. Like, they're truly owning their own mistakes and failures and saying them out loud and talking about them. And the more you talk about it, the less it has that like shame that we can associate with failure. It's like, yep, I did this. Can't believe I did that. It was really funny though. I learned from it. Now let's move on.
Yeah, I love that. And for sure, I mean, even just hearing you talk about it, I'm sure all of us are saying, yeah, that's the culture that we want. Not only for our teams, but quite frankly, Kristen, as between entrepreneur to entrepreneur, in my head, what I'm thinking is I'm just like, yeah, that's the culture I want with myself. I think if we can show ourselves grace in those moments, then we stop beating ourselves up and we can start flourishing a heck of a lot more. I think the entrepreneurs that are really crushing it in so many aspects of business and in life are those ones that are saying, let's go for it. Let's just do it. And you're right. Part of that is faith. Part of that is confidence. But a lot of it is just owning up to it and saying, it's something that happened. Let's keep moving forward. I've got to ask you this, Kristen, because within the context, we're talking so much about leadership. We're talking so much about teams. And in my head, building better leaders, that's at the core of what it is that you do. And I think about other disciplines, for example, like let's take yoga. The thing that's always stood out to me about yoga is people who do yoga, they say, I'm practicing yoga. And it is that. It is a practice. It's something that you don't just conceptually read about yoga and do yoga and say, okay, I know what the poses are. You practice yoga. How much of the work that you do in building up leaders, is it a practice? And talking about implementation and execution, how do they continue that practice?
Yeah, it absolutely is a practice, because a lot of this stuff is creating those neural pathways, because this is not the way that we're engineered to function. Like a lot of what improv teaches you is how to be playful as well, and how to take risks that might make you look silly. And our brains are optimized to help us survive fundamentally. And that means not taking risks and not making a fool of yourself potentially. So in order to change that, you have to do the reps and practice it. So I always say that when I do a workshop, the last thing I want to have happen is I give this workshop and everybody's feeling inspired and great, and then they just go back to their day-to-day and nothing changes. Because I think anybody who has worked in a corporation of any size has had plenty of trainings like that. And sure, if somebody wants me to do that, I'll still do it, but it's not anywhere near as effective as when you're actually putting practices into place that help you keep working on those skills. So that can be anything from like an individual practice, like just having a mindfulness practice is a really good starting point. Doesn't need to be meditation, doesn't need to be 20 minutes or an hour. Some people do. Like you can literally just do like, okay, I'm waiting for somebody to join my Zoom call. I have like 3 minutes. I'm just going to take a moment to focus on like what I can see in my immediate environment and what I can feel. Like, can I feel like the chair beneath my legs? Like just little things like that that help ground you in the moment and doing it over and over and over again, that will allow you to put more and more of this into practice.
Yeah, big kudos to you, Kristen, for always stressing that mindfulness does not have to equal meditation. I would imagine for you, crocheting is one aspect where it brings mindfulness. My equivalent of that is stringing a tennis racket. When I'm stringing my tennis racket, I'm not capable of thinking of anything other than weaving in and out of each string, getting all the strings right. So I love the fact that you call that out, and it's something that we can and we should bake into our daily life, our daily workflows and processes in between meetings, whatever it may be. So I love the fact that you keep calling that out. Kristen, we've talked about so many different aspects here. And when it comes to talking about practice, listeners, in a second, we're going to talk about Kristen's free guide. She'll drop all her links on us, but you listeners already know the tough question that I give to guests at the end, which is to sum up, what is an actionable takeaway, Kristen, between the leadership stuff, the team building? I think the shocking thing for me about today's conversation is how much we talked about ourselves as entrepreneurs. You're a fellow entrepreneur, you get it, just like every listener does. You're one of us. So with all of these concepts that you introduce us to today, what is one action that you think every entrepreneur would benefit from sitting down and saying, you know what, from this episode, from what Kristen shared with me, I'm going to implement this?
I would say the practice with trusting your instincts is going to be one of the most valuable things you can do as an entrepreneur. And a lot of that comes into play with things like doing exercises, but it also just comes to play in your day-to-day. I think as an entrepreneur, you get so much advice and opinions from so many different people, and a lot of times they're conflicting, so they can't all be right. And part of having a business is you need to be able to like, okay, listen to things, but then just pull out what actually resonates for you, what works for you and your business and your way of doing business. And just really getting good at understanding like, what is my gut instinct for this? Practicing that, and then also recognizing that inner judge when that's coming into play, because if you're aware of it, you'll hear it come in all the time, and being able to separate that out from what your instinct is. That will fundamentally help you make much better decisions as a business owner.
Heck yes, I absolutely love that advice for all listeners and for ourselves, Kristen, for every entrepreneur and wantrepreneur, especially all around the world. That trusting your instinct, it's such a strong message that I've heard from you today. And I love in that answer how you said, practice it, not even just in your business, practice it in your life. Start looking for those areas where you second guess yourself. And I love the fact that you called out all the conflicting advice that we hear, because you're right about that. And I love you so succinctly said it. It's one of the best ways I've ever heard it articulated, Kristen, which is they're always contradictory pieces of advice, so they can't all be right. I love that you called that out. So brilliant stuff all around here. I know that listeners are going to be chomping at the bit to start putting this stuff into practice. I know you already teased us with your free guide. So tell listeners where they should go to learn more about you, all the awesome work that you're doing with your company. Drop those links on us.
Absolutely. So my website is emboldify.com, which is EMBOLDIFY. And you can always reach out to me directly at Kristen@emboldify.com. And I also have all the various social media channels for both Emboldify and myself, but I am most active on LinkedIn. And my handle is just Kristen Brun, all one word. And you can find me on there. Feel free to connect, email. I would love to continue the conversation with your listeners.
Yes, I so appreciate guests when they come on and they have such a personal approach to the way that they run their businesses. It's true of so many of us inside the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur community. So Kristen, thank you so much for that. Listeners, you all know the drills. Wherever it is that you're tuning into today's episode, check those show notes. You'll find the link to Emboldify's website, which is emboldify.com. We'll also link to Kristen's LinkedIn, which she is putting out so much awesome stuff on her LinkedIn. You'll see how all these concepts that we talked about today permeate through all the content she creates, her approach to business, the way that she views leadership and team building. So much of that. So check the show notes to get all of those links. Otherwise, Kristen, thank you so much for joining us today on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thank you so much, Brian. I love this conversation.